Stanford University.
This presentation is delivered by the Stanford Center for Professional Development.
This today is my favorite lecture of the entire course. It's a little bit of a thin audience, probably due to the fact that we had an assignment due last night, and it's of course raining, and whenever it rains, attendance drops. But thanks for being here. Before we begin today, I want to talk a little bit about kind of share some experiences that you guys had on the assignment for last night. How much time did you guys spend? 20 hours? 10? 5? 50? 10? 12. 12? Cool. That's great feedback for kind of telling folks in the future just kind of what to expect. How did it go? Relatively straightforward? Anyone have some software invention that they were working on? How did that go?
Well, I think it's interesting that given the number of ideas that I've come up with over time, I tried to capture as many of them as possible. And I've heard that, provisional patents provide a great mechanism for just keeping track of your ideas, over time. And I feel like with software, it's just there's a lot of potential ideas, but I still would like to see what it would be like to write claims to exactly pin down something specific.
So it's I do teach a class on that, but it's something that if you're not going to spend, if that's not necessarily going to be your career, then it doesn't make a whole lot of sense learning that art. But that's when we know the best. That's when we get the best feedback, and that's actually when you go through the entire process that we get a ton of feedback. So my employees and myself included, when you actually go from provisional to full application, writing claims, to office actions, to negotiating, amending, arguing, to actually getting an issued patent, only then do you know 3 years from now, 4 years from now, did you do a good job on that provisional? And so that feedback loop is very, very, very long or delayed. But cool. Anyone else want to share their experience? Yeah. Sure.
About to what extent is the provisional patent looked at side by side to the real patent that comes in later on? How are those referenced together?
Yeah, and so when you need it. And so in the case where you're filed a full patent application and there isn't an art, there aren't prior art or references that are going to be used against that particular case, that fall within that window between the provisional application and the full application, then you don't need it. And so that's not even actually part of the discussion. But when you're trying to say that piece of art, that invention, that other publication, that other patents that the examiner found, we actually have a better date than that. Then all of a sudden that discussion starts. You get the benefit of the doubt on this one, but the patent office has the ability to go in and say your provisional doesn't actually support the claim that you're trying to get. Because it doesn't support it, you're not going to get that earlier date.
Also, how come in a provisional patent we don't have to explain about the obviousness or the novelty or anything like that? Is that all interpreted by the examiner at a later point in time?
Yeah, so we don't know what the prior art is. And you might have done a search, which you guys all did, and so you have some sense. You're not experts, not quite yet, and you didn't have all the databases available to you. And so the talking about other pieces of prior art just isn't all that relevant. What we need to do there, and what the whole purpose of the provisional is to teach someone how to make and use that particular invention. And everything else is extra and actually could be relatively negative, be used against you. Anyone else have that tension of wanting to write a longer background section or talk about prior art? It's typically what academics love to do. without anything else, I'm going to move on to today's lecture then. We're going to review, today in some ways is a review, but it's also kind of exposing potential weaknesses and or gaps in the knowledge that you have on two subjects. Patentability of an invention and whether or not, if you actually build a product, whether that would infringe something else. We'll talk about each of those independently. We'll talk about kind of a comparison, and at the end, we'll just conclude with a quick slide on how to actually pitch a startup to an investor with respect to IP. Eric Feldman? Is Eric here? Roshana?
Yep.
Roshana, what are the different sections of a patent? And how do these sections accomplish the functions of a patent? You've seen this question before, actually, so it's not supposed to be a trick question.
Okay. Does this relate to the assignments that we've done?
What's that?
Does it relate to the assignments that we've done, or those are the steps?
No, this is just when you look at an issued patent, what are the different sections of that patent?
The first would be a summary section, which would give you an idea of the patent. Another section there would be a description which describes your invention. I believe you have specific claims in a patent which state exactly what it is that you're patenting. Any references to prior patents where you cite the prior art. And I might have missed
so you
a few.
mentioned 4, and I was really just looking for 3, and you included that, so we're great. In fact, we're only focusing on 2. The drawings and the description. There's a technical section to a patent. And the technical section is doing 2 things. It's effectively, that's enabling someone to both make it and to use it. And so you're talking about what it actually is and all the different variations of it. And then we have a legal section. And that's where the claims come in. You might have just 1 claim. You might have 327. The bell curve is around 20 because that's actually, you get 20 free when you file a patent application. Anything more than that you pay for. It defines the rights of the patents right there in the claims. From now on, the rest of the class I'll take volunteers. When I call on you, just make sure you state your name. What are the requirements for a patent? What is patentability? Yep.
There's a few. There's 3 characteristic ones. You have to satisfy, which is novelty, obviousness, and usefulness. And you also have to satisfy the statutory bars that you have to file the application within the 1-year grace period. And then the patent itself also have to, it was a call, but I have to basically enable the reader to do great information. Did I ask you?
Useful, novel, and non-obvious. The invention, when made, must perform some useful function. Novel, the invention must not have been known or used by others in this country, or patented or described in some kind of publication, something along those lines, public use. And not obvious, the difference between what you're trying to go after and some combination of other things wouldn't be obvious to someone skilled in the art. I'm going to get into groups a couple times today. What we have here on the left is a flashlight. It's got a crank. And in there we have a battery. And what we have in the middle is a 1970s Panasonic radio. What we have on the right is a radio. It's got a crank. It's got some kind of mechanical energy storage device, kind of like a watch spring, something along those lines. Is this thing patentable? Turn to your neighbor. I'll call on someone in about 3 minutes.
I guess it would be a yes or no response. Personally, it would probably be a no, but just by the looks of it, probably it's wrong. It looks like it's a yes. All right. This is patentable? What did your team say?
Well, initially we said no, it's not patentable. But I think we kind of were confused about the meaning of mechanical storage device initially. Our first argument was that it was novel because it was a unique combination. It was useful, and but it wasn't obvious. It wasn't obvious because you were still using the mechanical energy of rotation to power a device. So that was an obvious transition. But if the mechanical storage device is like in the flashlight, you are using mechanical energy to directly convert that to electrical energy and then power the flashlight. But if it's a mechanical storage device, you could be cranking to store mechanical energy in a spring, and then that converts to electrical after the spring is released. Yep. So that's a different process, and that's not an obvious transition.
Okay. Anyone go along the same path? Anyone go down a different path?
you could make the argument that there's prior art involved in that if the figure on the left, they were smart enough to patent it such that it's a mechanical device not specifically to power a flashlight, but just to provide power, and that this particular embodiment happens to have a flashlight as the thing that's using the power, then there's prior art, and then therefore the radio is not
What would you want to see more about that? So it does look like a patent drawing. Do you want to look at the claims of the one that's on the left?
Yeah, I mean, if it says in one preferred embodiment to power a flashlight, but not limited to, then I think that would satisfy.
Which section would you want to look at more?
Also, I mean, I guess, yeah, the claims. The claims would be the only thing.
So let's stop right there.
Okay.
I led you down the trap, and you fell right in it. So it doesn't matter what the claims say. We want to know what was taught, what that particular document was teaching. It doesn't matter that this was actually a patent. And that's incredibly important for everyone to understand that. And that's why I have both a patent drawing and a photo that both of these things are prior art. The fact that the Panasonic radio was on sale, the fact that there was at least just one on sale was enough. That is prior art. What's on the left is also prior art. There weren't published applications back then. This was clearly pretty old. You could tell just by the style of the drawing. But this right here was something, so it was an issued patent. But regardless of whether it was an issued patent or an abandoned patent application or a still pending published application, this is still prior art. And if it is a patent document, the most important place for us to look is the technical section, is to figure out what was taught. The best place for them to actually teach other versions of this is in the technical section. Just like the ones that you guys just wrote for the provisional. You wrote a technical section. And hopefully you wrote other variations. While this hand crank can power a flashlight, it could also power other things. Like a radio. And that would be pretty devastating to have that particular teaching in that patent. But the claim, while it could teach something, is not the best place to look to find teachings in the prior art. Claims are incredibly difficult to read, incredibly difficult to understand. And someone would say, someone could easily argue, and probably successfully, that claims don't teach anything. But that the claims themselves have to be supported by the spec, the technical section, and so that's actually the best place to find this. Thanks for falling into my trap.
Learning, so.
Great. So now we know a little bit about what we're going to look at. And then there was this question of whether or not this is obvious. Is that the only question here? Whether or not this thing is obvious? Is there another question out there that we need to be asking when we're talking about patentability? Does everyone agree that this is useful and it's novel? Okay. So this question now easily converts into, is this thing obvious? And we have one team, what was the argument?
Well, it would depend on the definition of the mechanical storage device. If the mechanical storage device is actually, it's converting directly from mechanical energy to electrical energy, then it's an obvious transition. But if it's actually being stored as a spring, then that could be something that they could argue that's
So then we provide a little bit of definition, then we could argue this a little bit more. And so this mechanical crank does power it as you're actually doing this, but you're actually also winding up a spring. And that spring can then later on unwind and provide electrical energy to power this thing. On the other hand, the flashlight with a crank, this thing, as you crank it, it converts it, and so you could power it right then and there in real time. But the excess energy that you're providing is being stored in some chemical battery. Is this thing obvious? Yeah.
Well, we kind of went with a different approach. Well, first of all, we assume that the crank is powering the radio, not to power a flashlight on the radio. But then we said that But depending on the description of the radio in the middle, if the technical component actually states that any embodiment of this invention should not require the user to manually input power into this mobile device, then that would make it non-obvious because it teaches away.
So you're saying, well, it would depend on this radio and the description behind it. The problem is that radio doesn't really have a description. It's that thing right there. There's a public use and an on sale, and so we don't necessarily, it probably doesn't have a warning right on it, or it doesn't have a claim right on it. It doesn't need manual input. It's just a radio. Yeah.
Well, then I would ask an average radio manufacturer or something, if that's something that would be obvious at that time that the invention came out on, right? And if that was something ingenious, having a mobile power for a radio, then I'd say it would be non-obvious.
So you would ask the people that are making the radio whether or not that was an obvious invention. Is that one skill to the art? Someone who's making that radio? It's a subset of one skilled in the art. I don't think they're necessarily going to see this. How do we ask that? And this is so like, we're asking the real question, is this patentable? And the real question doesn't actually involve doing a survey of people back in the 70s to whether or not this was obvious, right? We need to decide right here with this information that we have, is this thing patentable? What did you guys decide?
Well, going off of that, we thought basically the radio would be, so we don't think that the powering of the radio is one of the original, is sort of a non-obvious thing to improve upon sort of an original radio design like that, or is it being, sound output perhaps, or signal strength would probably be something that's most obvious to the radio design. So providing mechanical storage to power it instead would be non-obvious.
All right. So what does that translate into? So you're saying that this is actually patentable.
Yes.
At what level then? So what would be some of the things that would be patentable? Let's start to kind of create this claim. What would that look like?
The claim would be on basically the crank and the mechanical storage of the device differentiates it from the radio.
Okay.
So that's the claim is.
What we have already here on the left, this is a flashlight with a crank, and if I wanted to, I could also pull up, let's say, a grandfather clock, or a watch, that we crank by hand, and then it's just a big watch spring, and then it releases this energy. And so if I threw that into the mix, is this thing patentable? And this is really simple technology, guys. And the question is, is this patentable? What do you say?
Oh, I think so, because even if it's one of those things that sounds obvious when it's together, but if nobody has done it, it's useful, we've said it. So it hasn't been done, it means that there's something in the mix that's non-obvious.
It doesn't, though. Because that train of thought then just collapses obviousness into novelty. If it's never been done before, then it's not obvious. It's just saying that obvious doesn't even exist. So it's just saying that if it's never been done before, then you're fine. And so then we're completely ignoring this other requirement of, is it obvious?
So probably the flashlight with the crank and battery shows us how to use a crank, and probably traditionally energy has been stored in a spring. So, mechanical storage devices have been used before. So, again, that's a combination of those two things, and that might just be obvious.
I think you're right. Let's take the might out of there and say, that's your argument. This thing is obvious. There are two known technologies. Great. What are some of the things that or some kind of things that bolster obviousness arguments?
I guess if there was any any energy or time that would be required to think of that. If you're actually adding anything into the inventory, public inventory of tools to use, and in this case, I don't think there was anything added. They just took existing inventions and put them together. The sum was not greater than the parts.
It's one way to look at obvious, kind of what's happening with that particular combination. Sure. Maybe expected results is kind of the argument there that you're trying to get at. That there would be the expectation of combining these two things together would be that this is how it would work. There's nothing unexpected about this. Yeah.
I feel like to argue against that, if you put these things together, it would serve a purpose that's different from either of those. Because I was actually envisioning that radio as some sort of like emergency radio, just like the way the light would work, and that in a situation where that device is actually used, it would be very different than having a radio or a flashlight separately. So I think in that sense, it is novel and obvious and non-obvious.
So that the use of where you're trying to go with this, in terms of you want to be able to have, to be able to receive emergency broadcast signals, that a radio that has a dead battery and a flashlight, which doesn't have a receiver, can't give you. Okay. How much does intention or use actually play a part in this?
Is it not considered because it's not part of novelty, obviousness, or usefulness?
Yeah, when we're trying to figure out whether or not something can be combined, then we may take a look at the motivation to combine these things. And so then the motivation isn't there to create this thing. But this thing also has other purposes too, right? And so this thing could also just be a portable radio that now you could take camping. And it doesn't run out of batteries. Where might you find this portable radio? What store?
REI.
REI. Where might you find a portable hand crank flashlight?
REI.
Might they be in the same aisle?
Yes.
Would it be obvious to combine these things?
Doesn't it require a little more power to power a radio than power a flashlight?
So we're going to go after a hand crank radio that provides lots of power. Period.
The very same crank as you have on the left, you may never be able to get power in the radio.
It's the other way around.
Depends on how big that speaker is. Depends on how strong you want to be able to take that signal. Yeah. What's the answer? If your client comes to you and says, is this thing patentable? They've already done a patent search for you. All you have to do is give them an answer. Is this thing patentable? Should I spend 40 grand pursuing a patent application on this invention? And right now I have a bunch of shrugged shoulders, I don't know, yes, no, maybes.
To get back to her last comment, I think that depends on how the crank works, and if it's exactly the same as the flashlight, or if you may modify it in a way to provide more power. Mm-hmm. In which case, if you claim that modification on the crank, then it can be.
Sure, so maybe there is some kind of planetary gear system in there to multiply the power or something like that, and you'd have to spend all day like doing this really fast just to get like a little burst. Is that patentable? My hunch is that mankind has been playing around with planetary gears and that kind of stuff for a while now. Super simple question. Remember when, so we're going to skip back. Remember when I had a little diagram of a pyramid? Who could actually explain what that was? We know the shape. Awesome. You have it visualized in your head, or at least right there in space.
Levels of abstraction.
Yep.
So
I know there were 4 of them. At the very top, there was the big idea. That was this is an upside down pyramid. At the very bottom, there's CAD. That's the specifics, every radius and specific dimensions and material properties, whatever. In between, there are 2 things: the sketch and the white sheet, which are various shades transitioning from the really big idea, electrical device makes sound, to it's got that big knob in the middle, etc. So on one level of abstraction, electrical device that makes sound, no, not patentable. On the specific every little curvature and radius, sure, of course you could patent that. Wouldn't be useful. Somewhere in between those 2, white paper or sketch level will be the halfway between that might actually be patented.
Awesome. Thank you. What was your name again? Thank you. Applying that here, is this thing patentable? Yes. We could say it depends on what level of abstraction. Is that the right answer? Because if we go after hand crank radio, are we going to get it? No. If we apply for CAD, effectively 2 million words all in a row with a period at the end, are we going to get that? And so what we're really trying to do here is to figure out what part of this is actually patentable. We're trying to get at what is the 200-word version of it. It looks a little bit like this. This is a really tough question. It actually ended up going up on appeal. So the fact that there wasn't any kind of consensus around the room of whether or not this was patentable, the patent office couldn't even figure this out. This is what ended up being issued as Claim 11 for this particular patent, the 310 patent. Generator having a rotatable shaft, a gear train coupled to the shaft, mechanical energy storage device, a handle coupled to the source, whereby rotating the handle adds mechanical energy to the source, a power control circuit coupled to the generator and configured to prevent uncontrolled release of mechanical energy by controlling the voltage output of the generator, and a radio coupled to the power control circuit. Before we get to this slide, I usually in this lecture talk about if you actually put these 2 things together, what would it sound like? Like a flashlight, when you hand crank this thing, it's nice and bright, and it starts to dim. You don't really care. Like, it's still providing some light. But when you have this radio and you're at a campsite, and you set the volume, and you hand crank this thing up, and then you go and you do some marshmallow action, and then you take, you're sitting around and you're drinking some beers. Like, at that point, some point, like, you're going to start losing some voltage, and then you're going to start losing the volume. And so when you put these 2 things together, you don't actually get the thing on the right. When you put the hand crank flashlight with the radio, you don't actually get the thing on the right. There was something there. There was this unexpected thing. There's this synergy thing that we had kind of touched on and we're dancing around. But this is it right here, this power control circuit. That this is actually what's necessary to make this thing happen. This is what's necessary when you put these 2 things together, it doesn't work. This is why I say great ideas aren't patentable. Because the great idea here would be a hand crank radio. And that's not patentable. But when you actually make it, and you test it, and you're trying to figure out, is this thing going to work, this is actually what you're going to run up against. And when you put these 2 things together, you set the volume, you crank it, and then the volume is going to start going down and lower and softer, and then you can't hear it anymore. That's really annoying. And then you have to run over and crank up the volume just so you can listen to the radio. Like, that's really annoying. That's fine with respect to flashlights, but it's not fine with respect to radios. And this is the thing that's missing when you put these 2 things together. And this is the thing that you typically would probably only find out when you make this thing. Is this thing on the right patentable? Yes. But it was about trying to find that abstraction layer that this thing was patentable. Is this thing on the right patentable? We now know there's a hand crank radio. But this particular radio on the right, the flashy red one, now gets satellite radio, XM. Not just AM and FM, we're talking XM. Is this thing patentable? What is patentable about it?
XM satellite receiver that makes it work better or makes it so that it's different from the hand crank radio, which might not receive that additional signal.
But there were satellite radios at the time. So this is now just a hand crank radio that gets AM and FM plus an XM receiver. It's an obvious combination. Who's going to argue otherwise?
I mean, one of the arguments against non-obviousness is that the combination of prior art does not result in the same function as prior art. Right? In this case, you have a regular radio crank added with satellite radio that gives you another radio that receives radio signals. So basically, it functions.
But if I showed you a radio receiver, just not portable, home version or car version, and it had AM, FM, and XM right there, and in that was an XM receiver, and it's in a radio, and then here is the AM, FM hand crank radio. Would it be obvious to modify that hand crank radio to now include XM?
This would again depend on if the addition of XM requires some change to the power circuit. So
what if you just needed a little bit more power, like 10%?
If you need to redesign some part of it, or if you're using a new method, I think it's not obvious.
I think that's the answer. And I think that it comes down to that detail of actually adding that XM in there. Maybe this is why you needed a much bigger handle. Maybe there was something in the way that you store the mechanical energy. Maybe there was something in the way that you filter that in some way. I don't really know the answer because I didn't build this. My hunch is that it's not patentable. My hunch is that the patent office is going to say, look, this is just an obvious combination of these two things. But I'm leaving my foot in the door to be able to say, it's possible that at some abstraction layer deep enough that we're going to say, look, you needed these details in here to actually make this thing work. You couldn't just take this home receiver that has AM, FM, and XM and then shove that XM receiver into this portable. It won't work that way. I don't know why it would or would not. My hunch is that it's going to work exactly the same. But yeah, I think you're right. Without knowing actually exactly what it took to make that XM receiver and to put that inside here, we won't really know the answer to this. Here is the big idea sketch, white paper and CAD, upside down pyramid. It's a reminder of just how abstraction layers play a part in this. If we can write some claims that distinguish the invention from previous inventions, distinguish it from combination of previous inventions, then all of a sudden now we have something that's patentable. If we can write it at an abstraction layer that's able to do this. This is patentability. Is there any questions on this before we flip over to the other side of patent law? Yeah.
Do you have any examples of a patent that able to kind of be kind of broad, but still at the same time have economic value?
So if it's broad, it's always going to be incredibly valuable, right?
Oh, sorry,
Sure. So there may be some value on protecting something very narrowly so that copycats can't come around. And so that someone can't actually make exactly what you're doing. And so that could be incredibly narrow. It's protecting exactly this. But that might be useful if you're dominating in that particular space. the radius of a phone, maybe. Something, on the corners of a phone. To get something that's very narrow like that, which sounds really ridiculous, might be incredibly valuable. So some of this has to do with like how big that market size is and how expensive those particular goods are. We're flipping over. You get a volunteer for what's actually considered an infringement.
The word to this that works, either making it, selling it, or maybe the intention to either make or sell it.
So making and selling are two of them. Intention to sell it is a third in there, so offering to sell. There's two more. Yeah, that's one. There's another really important one though. Using. Yeah. What's your name again?
Maitri. Good.
Thanks. Makes, uses, sells, or imports. There's another one in there that's offers to sell. During the term of a patent infringes a patent. We've now looked at Claim 11 of the free play radio, and we've now seen what that looks like. This right here is another portable radio. You probably don't own one of these. You probably have never seen one of these. That's the way actually most patents go. They don't actually typically make it to market. But this was nevertheless an invention of that here's a portable radio, and the concept is that you're going to squeeze this thing right here. And when you squeeze that, air goes through here. It goes by a fan. It spins a little shaft. There's a bunch of gears in here. There's a mechanical energy storage device right here. And then it powers the radio. Turn to your neighbor. Does this actually infringe that other patent? All right. So the question that you have a client that comes to you and says, I got this idea right here. I want to know if it infringes the patent on this thing right here to the right. What's your first gut reaction?
It says radio with crank. This new thing doesn't have a crank. So, no infringement.
And that's one way of looking at it, right? What's the slightly more rigorous way? Can we just compare drawings and say these things don't look anything like each other? They don't look anything like each other. But that's not enough, is it? What do we have to do? We have to look at the claims. What do we do when we look at the claims? There's 2 steps.
Identify like the necessary elements of the invention, the hand pump one, and then compare those to the claims and see if
there's a yes and no. So when we look at these words, we're interpreting them and making sure that we have the right claim interpretation, but we're not actually identifying the most important ones. If what we're doing here is saying, oh, you know what? When they got this thing, what the most important thing was a power control circuit. You might go jump to that other one and say it's got a power control circuit and therefore infringes. And that might be the wrong answer. And so it has nothing really to do with what made this thing patentable. And people with a little bit of knowledge in this space like to jump to that conclusion. That I know why this thing was patentable, and this doesn't have that same thing. And so therefore this thing, or it does have the same thing, so therefore it does infringe. That's not necessarily the answer. What do we have to do? We have the claims in front of us. What's the step?
We have to make sure that it infringes every element of that one claim.
Yeah.
And in this case, it doesn't because it says it's a handle whereby rotating the handle adds mechanical energy. And in our case, it's pushing up like the air valve.
So you went through here, step by step, phrase by phrase, and said there's one particular phrase in here that we don't have.
Mm-hmm.
Who's got a counter argument to that? Yeah.
I think it really depends on your definition of the word handle.
You wouldn't really think that we had to do a lot of interpretation of these words, right? But it turns out that it kind of depends on what handle means. Go for it.
So, when you first think about it, you think handle, okay, something you grab onto and move. But if you think of handle in an abstract sense of something that allows something to do something to something else, like some way of really generic here, like some way.
Even a slightly less abstract version, something that you put your hand on.
Right, or even not necessarily a person putting their hand on it. That's kind of, that's where the word comes from. But if air is using a propeller of a fan to handle the shaft, then
so I've taught this class a lot of times. I've never actually had that exact argument. I actually love that argument, though.
But that's.
I'm gonna go one step to the side and be slightly more absurd, even than that, and say when I take this thing and instead of this dinky little speaker right there, I hook it up to some great floor-mounted speaker, and I got this incredible amp. And then I take this thing by the hand, and I spin it over my head, rotating it. What happens? What happens? Rotating it. But what is there some air that goes through there and turns that fan? Probably. And so is there something that comes out of this speaker? Yeah. Is that what was intended? Does that matter? Is this thing a handle? I mean, it's meant to be squeezed, right? But it doesn't say, like, right on there, squeeze only. And even if it did, would that matter? So could I argue that this thing actually has a handle whereby rotating it is actually going to add mechanical energy? And if so, does this thing now infringe?
use it that way. Doesn't it matter how?
Is that part of that? Is that part of this equation? Is that part of the analysis?
I mean, when you're looking at how someone is going to teach you to actually enable, like the enablement requirement, he's teaching you how to use it.
The enablement requirement is for the technical section, and it's stuck in the technical section. It is to make sure that we as society, we as inventors, don't skimp on our ability to teach the rest of the world this great invention. That we don't hold back. It's not necessarily to provide any type of insight into the claims or the legal rights. I completely agree with you. That wasn't the intention of this. We're not teaching this. What I'm saying, and I use this example because I love this example, because it's a pretty absurd definition of handle. Let's jump to yours. This is pretty creative. So now we have in here, this is the handle, whereby rotating the handle adds mechanical energy to the source. Whereby rotating this handle, that works, right? This thing a handle? A handle is something that may turn. It might do something. It might handle something else that's happening to it. What I'm getting at here is that this often turns on the definition or the interpretation of these phrases. And we often love to skip that step. There's only 2 steps in infringement analysis. There's only 2. Interpret it and then compare. And my guess is that nearly everyone, minus a few, have jumped over that first step and jumped right into comparing. And they looked at it and said, there's no handle here. You already had an interpretation in your mind what handle meant. What's your name again?
Kessler.
I think it comes down to this particular phrase. I think in the end, the winning argument is that there is no handle and that you're going to be able to get by and at least no literal infringement. There might be something interesting here on doctrine of equivalence. Let's step back for a second. Why was handle actually even in this claim? Why was this thing patentable? This particular claim. We talked about this already. Why was this thing patentable? It was the power control circuit. Why does this thing have handle in there? I'd say that it wasn't necessary to be in there. It might have been necessary to have some kind of crank. It might have been necessary to have something. But why handle? What would you have used?
So, I mean, you could go with non-constant power source, and you could have it extend like solar panels and stuff. Also,
we'll get there in a second.
Okay.
But say let's just focus on mechanical energy. What would you call this thing? Right? What was that?
Method of rotation.
So now we're getting into method and steps, right? And we can't do that when we're stuck in a systems claim. And so that's one freedom that we don't have is to mix these 2 things. One way that patent attorneys kind of figured out how to mix it is to say a means for. And so it means for importing or inputting mechanical energy. And now we have everything that's equivalent to the stuff that can input mechanical energy. Means for was incredibly popular about 20 years ago. Right now the courts give it a fairly narrow definition when they do claim interpretations, and so it's not actually favorable now. But there's clever ways of getting around it. So if this isn't means for inputting mechanical energy, what is it? So it's a mechanical actuator. Let's put that in there. A mechanical actuator coupled to the source whereby actuating the actuator adds mechanical energy to the source. That works for me. Would that include just a button that we push up and down? Yep. Would it include a lever that we slide back and forth? Yep. Would it include a trackball that we spin? It's an actuator. It's taking something and converting it in some other way, right? And so maybe the right answer is it was poorly written, and there was something else that should have been done here. My hunch is that this particular patent application was written by an electrical engineer, and they were focused on this power control circuit. And they weren't necessarily thinking about the fact that, oh, this mechanical energy over here, that's for MEs, that's really simple stuff. But they weren't thinking that there could be something more than just a handle that rotates. And they weren't brainstorming, they weren't thinking of this in terms of, you know what, it could be other stuff here. Why wasn't this claim just a power control circuit? This is what got the claim allowed, right? Remember when we did that analysis? So why isn't this claim just a power control circuit?
That's all prior art.
It's been done before. And so they needed to have enough other things in there so that the combination was new. They needed to have a handle in there or something, a mechanical actuator, because typically mechanical actuators aren't coupled with power control circuits. And so they needed that in there. And so we're going to give some things some breadth and some things some narrowness. This power control circuit was fairly narrow. Power control circuit coupled to the generator and configured to prevent uncontrolled release of mechanical energy from the source by controlling the voltage output of the generator. This was actually a pretty narrow element. The one right above it looks broad, but it turns out it could have been broader. And if it was a little bit broader, then this thing right here, which no one could have foreseen at the time, would now infringe. This is the exact situation that you're going to be in over and over again. You're not going to be able to imagine this thing right here when you're making the free play radio. You're not going to be imagining someone could do this with a pump. But you need to work with your patent attorney to be able to cover this. And you need to be able to zero in on what is the kernel, the guts, the heart of what the invention is. And when you look at it in the very beginning, it looks like, oh, it's this combination of putting a crank on a radio. And then you start diving down a little bit deeper. And it turns out that this power control circuit was the thing that's going to help this thing be patentable. And when you find that, it's imperative so that you broaden out the other elements. You can't just eliminate them because then it's just going to read on the prior art of a power control circuit. But this thing right here turned out to be pretty important of how it was written. I suspect that the free play radio guys don't really care that this exists or doesn't exist. That's just my hunch. But that's something where this could have escaped infringement, where it could have easily been trapped by infringement by just a simple rewording of that claim.
Element like more narrow, but it seems like we're just completely ignoring the doctrine of equivalence. Like you could argue that this hand pump has the same function in a very similar way for like the same result, right?
I could definitely see that it has a similar function, and I could definitely see that it has a similar result, but I think that someone could argue that it gets at it in a very different way. Right? I mean, you're pushing wind through a tube, and that's a little bit different than grabbing a crank and rotating it. And so that relying on doctrine of equivalence is not the best strategy. And being able to, the doctrine of equivalence was given some very broad interpretations at some point. That's not as much anymore. And in fact, some people have argued that doctrine of equivalence is now dead. And that, like, this is when you're walking into an infringement scenario, and the best thing you got is doctrine of equivalence, then you shouldn't even bring that lawsuit in the first place.
Let's say that they wrote it, an actuator that's actuated or whatever. So then this infringes. Could you challenge that infringement if they're in their technical description, all their embodiments had a crank and they never showed anything else?
Yes, and thanks for bringing this up. So oftentimes when that mechanical actuator, that needs a definition, right? I mean, if you just look that up in dictionary, like I don't know what you're going to find under mechanical actuator. And so that needs to be interpreted. And when you interpret that particular phrase, one of the places to look for the interpretation is the specification, the technical section. And if there is one example there, and that is a hand crank, then all of a sudden mechanical actuator equals hand crank. And that the effort to broaden that out failed. And so that was actually one of the other reasons that I teach you guys to put in variations when you do the provisional. It can include this thing over here, but it could also include these other things. And that's why I stress in my law firm kind of the creative process, that I try very hard not to burn out any of my employees, that they work 40, 50 hours a week instead of the typical 80 or 90, because they need to be creative to be able to do this. To be able to say, you know what, there are a bunch of different ways. We're going to sit back here and brainstorm this instead of just cranking through this patent application. We need to be able to think about, well, what other ways are there? And when you ask the inventor, what other ways are there, what do you think you might get? There are no other ways to do this. This is the best way of doing it. You would never use a button. You would never use a lever. You would never use a hand pump. Like, those things are ridiculous. This is the way to do it. Just do your job, patent attorney, and protect this thing. And so we do that brainstorming internally. And we come back and say, look, in one version of it, it's a hand crank. But in other versions, it could be other things, like levers or buttons. The weirdest one, I think, is the trackball, but I think that still works. That's why it's important to have that in there, because then that gives that, now mechanical actuator has a broad definition. So when it's interpreted, it means something that at least covers these four things, but if it at least covers these four things and that one of those things is trackball, then clearly it's like, wow, this thing is an actually really broad word. That's why we do it. That's why we have a bunch of variations for all of those elements that we write in a patent application. That's why you need that in the provisional. Yeah.
So how many variations would you really, like for example, this instance, would you include all four of those variations? Would you include all 10 variations that you thought of?
I actually think there's not only diminishing returns, but actually far negative consequences. So what if I gave you a list of 22 things?
Thought of those are all the things.
That's exhaustive, right?
Yeah.
And those are the only 22 things. And if the alleged infringer came up with something that wasn't on that list, it might be easy to conclude that, it wasn't on the list, and that list was exhaustive, and so therefore it doesn't infringe. And so I actually think that when patent attorneys just rattle off, 20 things, that they're actually doing their client a disservice. But I think that it's interesting to name 3, 4, 5 different things, and that's not exhaustive, but just rather an example of all the different things that mechanical actuator could include.
You said lever, and a couple other things. You did say trackball, but then someone else
Trackball one, would there be a discussion over whether or not?
So it's going to go down to what is the definition of mechanical actuator. And I think if you have 3 or 4, or 5 examples in there, then I think the definition has to be anything that takes mechanical energy. Okay. And under that definition, then trackball is going to be stuck, captured.
I have a question about selling. So you start infringing if you sell something, but then if now you're partnering with a company that has that specific patent and you're selling through that company, but you're an independent company, would you have the same problem? Or, do you see what I mean? Like
So the part, why would they sue you?
No, not them, but if it's not non-exclusive, so a few others have the same.
So when you license out rights to a patent, you license the right not to be sued. You don't license the right to sue others. That right is only held by the patent owner. There are some exceptions, but that is more or less law, that the owner is the one that has the right to sue. And the others have this right not to be sued.
But the owner can still get after you then?
Well,
or not because you're selling through someone that has...
Sorry, now I understand your question. I thought you meant you're selling through someone that owns the patent.
No.
Sorry. So you are still manufacturing it, so you're still under infringement, you're doing the making, or you're the importer, or you're selling it to someone else that's now reselling it. And so all of those actions would be an infringement. The only way that's going to be completely around that is if you had an offshore, say you were the one that had the manufacturing facility in China, and you delivered it in China to the distributor who's now importing it and selling it. Now you've done nothing wrong with respect to the United States, but that would be the only scenario there that would get you off the hook. Product method might infringe a patent or may infringe a patent if it contains all of the elements of a single claim. We didn't talk about claims 1 through 10. We didn't talk about claims 12 through 37. If claim 12 was dependent on claim 11, and 11 was the one that we looked at, and 11 was something that we said infringed, would 12 be infringed?
Yeah.
And one yes, and one no?
Yes, because it's dependent on the previous thing.
So if 11 is infringing, and 12 is dependent on 11, would we necessarily infringe claim 12? We don't even know what it has in there, right? It's adding another element. And so we don't know what that is, and we might not actually have that. And so that might be adding where it has 3 antennas. And so we could infringe claim 11, but might not infringe claim 12. This is where patentability and infringement are completely opposite. If claim 11 was patentable, then claim 12 is for sure patentable. Because if 11 hadn't been done before, and you're adding more information, more limitations in claim 12, then clearly 12 hasn't been done before. And if 11 was patentable, then 12 is going to be patentable. But it doesn't work this way. If we infringe claim 11, we don't know whether or not we infringe claim 12. Let me ask the flip of that. If we don't infringe claim 11, could we infringe claim 12? No. Why not?
Because it's a dimension claim, you had to infringe the dimension claim so that you already established that the elements in claim 11 is present, and also the elements of claim 12 is also present.
And so if we say that there's an element that's missing in claim 11, and claim 12 is adding some things, it's still missing that one element. It doesn't matter how many more elements are added in claim 12. It's a little tricky how that all works out. We had a preview of the solar panel earlier, and here it is. This is wrapping up patentability and infringement right here in this slide. Your client comes to you with a hand crank radio with a solar panel. Is this patentable? And does this infringe claim 11? Turn to your neighbor. 2 simple questions. Let's talk about it in about 2 minutes. All right. First question. Is this patentable? Team in the back. You guys. Is this thing patentable?
We believe it is.
Why?
Because the solar panel adds an extra new element. If you write it down at a deep level of abstraction, you go add in that extra detail, and you have something new. It's a new combination.
Okay. So because it's new and this combination hasn't been done before, then this thing is patentable? Who's got the opposing viewpoint on that? Yeah.
Well, perhaps it would be patentable at a narrow enough level of abstraction, but it's definitely not non-obvious. There's plenty of other small personal devices that have solar powers incorporated in them. So the circuit's been done.
There's a calculator that has solar panels, and I'm pretty sure that's been done for decades.
Yes.
And so that solar calculator has a battery in there, and it also has a solar panel. So this thing is just an obvious combination. That's the next argument.
That's only concerning the stuff that you can see. What if there's something inside that's an important part of the circuit or how it's developed?
Let's take a guess. What is that?
My guess would be there's nothing new. But
A guess around that would be probably something that combines or switches between solar and hand crank. Or, I mean,
there's a couple things going on here, right?
Yeah.
So you got hand crank, you have the mechanical energy storage device, and you have solar panel.
Energy storage, so how do you combine the two?
I see a lot of buttons on there. I have no idea what all those buttons do. You know, like GPS system, you know, cell phone.
That's pretty good. I like that. It's got lots of buttons, and we haven't seen all that many buttons in the past, and so this thing is for sure patentable. There is actually something to be said of that. Wow, this looks complicated. It's patentable. There's actually something that's that's actually very, very accurate. There's a very strong correlation between this is complicated and this thing is patentable. Because what are you doing in complicated? You're adding stuff. And the more stuff you add, the harder time the patent office has of finding all those things and providing that this combination would be motivated and it would work. And so the more things you add, it's actually really hard to find, to argue that that's an obvious combination. Hardest patent applications that we write are the ones that are really simple, the ones that are really elegant, the things that take stuff away. That stuff's really, really hard. Two-legged chair. That was really, really hard. To be able to have a chair that the legs, it's a camping chair, you use your legs as the other two legs, and that was really, really hard. Because every chair, history of man, has two legs. And to be able to say that that chair, two legs hasn't been done before, was really, really hard. This thing has lots of buttons, so therefore it's patentable. I like that argument. And this thing probably has something at some abstraction level that deep enough that would say, okay, this is patentable. It's important for you guys to start developing this gut reaction as to what that thing is, other than, I'm sure there's something there. I'm sure there's something there is actually pretty accurate too. That like, wow, you guys spent a lot of time on this, and it looks really pretty and look complicated, so there's probably something there. Is actually fairly accurate, but getting to, I bet you this is the part that's patentable, is the important aspect here. To be able to say, all right, well, when you put these two things together, how does it work? When you take the hand crank radio and the solar panel on the calculator, and you slap the solar panel onto the hand crank radio, does it work? And what needs to happen for that thing to actually make it into market? What adjustments need to be made? What other things need to be going on there? That's what I want you guys to start thinking about. Anyone could just say, oh yeah, put these two things together and it kind of looks the same. Yeah, it's got a solar panel, everything will work. But what I want you guys to be thinking, you're skilled engineers, look at this thing and say, is that going to work? What else does this thing need to actually work in the market. Just like the hand crank radio before, saying, all right, it needs a power control circuit to be able to monitor this voltage, so that this thing doesn't, that the volume doesn't degrade over time. That was one question. Yeah.
I have a question of if this solar powered machine infringes on all the independent claims of the
We
previous.
haven't talked about infringement yet. We'll talk about it next time. Is this thing patentable? We think there's something there. We have a couple of different answers, but we think I generally feel like you guys have a grasp of this. Second question. Does this infringe? Team in the back. Does this infringe?
Yes.
Why?
Just in the one claim that we looked at, it has all those elements.
But it also has a solar panel.
Doesn't matter.
But look at it, it's got a ton of buttons. It's silver. So it has all the elements. We've interpreted them. We know what those elements mean, and this thing has them. So this thing infringes. Nothing teaches a control circuit for enabling the generator to power, for enabling the generator and the panel to charge some capacitor. We haven't seen this, at least in the prior art that we talked about. The solar panel calculator and the hand crank radio, neither one of those had this circuit in there that allowed a solar panel and a hand crank radio to power some capacitor. We didn't see this. And this was actually pulled from a claim of an issued patent. The generator is patentable. The radio, however, includes every single one of those elements, so therefore infringes Claim 11. Biggest question of the entire, I'll come back. The biggest question of the entire course. So what is this relationship then between patentability and infringement? Is there any? There isn't any. These two things are completely unrelated. Assuming the patent out there for the free play radio. If you made the satellite free play radio, is this thing patentable? We were leaning towards no. Does this thing infringe? Yes. A retro radio. Let's make a 1970s radio. Does this thing, is it patentable? No. Panasonic can't refile their expired patents. This thing has been out there way too long. Anything that was for sale in the 70s, you know that you could go ahead and make, and it's not going to infringe, and it's certainly not going to be patentable. The solar free play radio, we thought that it was patentable because it had some power control circuit in there that allowed the solar panel and the hand crank to both power the capacitor. So we thought it was patentable, but we also said it infringed because it had every single element of Claim 11. And then the air pump radio. We didn't talk about the patentability of that. And my guess that thing was patentable. And in fact, I did take it from patent drawings, from an issued patent. And we said that that handle, it didn't have a handle, and so therefore it didn't have infringement. These are all four scenarios, right? All four of them. These things don't have anything to do with each other. Yeah.
Is there ever a reason that you would want to patent something if you know that it infringes?
What might that be? What usefulness would that be?
Could prevent competition from having that idea of something that you think is competitive.
Would that thing be valuable? Would that patent be valuable? So maybe you're the solar panel maker, and you're the solar panel expert, and you're the one that knows how to integrate solar panels in just about anything. And you see the free play radio out there, and you want to approach the free play radio guys and say, "Look, I think you should make a solar panel version of it." What might you do before that? File a patent on it. And then when you go to them to talk about it, and they say, "Yeah, that's a great idea. I think we'll take it from here. No need to swap business cards." You could say, "Just want to remind you that we did file a patent application on this." And then all of a sudden you might be securing or that having stronger leverage over that particular negotiation. So sure. But there's plenty of other examples as well. That even though something is going to a product that was covered by the patent that you are actually applying for, selling that product would infringe something else, you might still move forward with that patent. Does everyone get this? This is incredibly important. You now know the test for infringement and the test for patentability. Without this lecture, most people get these tests mixed up 6 months from now. That you apply obviousness to infringement, and you say all elements and dependent claims are patentable, and apply it to the other side, and it gets all screwed up. These two things are completely separate.
Solar free play, if they tried to make and use that product, selling it on the broad markets, they could be sued by the satellite free play people.
Not the satellite. Well, let's just go back to
the original people for their profits or percentage of that because they used every element.
Yep. Even though they might have gotten a patent on it.
To prevent other people from doing that solar aspect.
Patents are a negative right. They're not a positive right. This is a really weird concept, but this is where it all comes together right at this exact moment. That patents prevent someone else from doing something. They don't give you the right to actually do anything. And so that if you were to get a patent on the satellite free play radio, that doesn't give you the right to actually make that. It gives you a negative right to say that no one else can do this thing. But you don't actually have the right to do it. This is an incredibly important, very counterintuitive concept. Last slide of the lecture today. There will be a little bit further discussion right after this. But so when investors ask, "What's your IP?" they're really asking two different questions because there's two different sides of patent law. What they're asking is, do you have anything that's protectable? Have you filed any patent applications? Do you have something that we could file a patent application on if we were to invest money in your company? Is there something patentable here? The other question that they're asking is, if you were to make this product, are you going to infringe? Patentability opinions and freedom to operate opinions, freedom to operate being the same thing as kind of an infringement letter, or infringement opinion, are two different things. They're asking, if we actually made this today, would we be sued? And that question doesn't have anything to do with the first question. And the answers don't have anything to do with each other. You might say yes and yes, or yes and no, or no or yes, or no and no. But those two questions don't have anything, the answers don't have anything to do with each other. Because these things are negative rights. Any questions on this stuff? Investors call me all the time. Yeah. And so my clients will just say, if you have any IP questions, here's our attorney, and they'll introduce me via email. Some of those conversations are really short. Tell me a little about the patent strategy. And if it's an early stage company, it's like, hey, look, this is what we're planning on doing. we filed a provisional. The inventors, filed their own. And when we get funding, I'm going to go back and file another provisional application. And then we're filing 3 more on these technologies in the fall, and then 2 more in the spring. And this is how we're going to build up this patent portfolio.
For someone, maybe directly from the investor, but not through a client, just because they want to check on some technology or
Sure. So
thing.
sometimes now my client is the investor, right? Not the startup. I used to do a little bit of that work, but I found that work to be not as satisfying. The investors typically want a binary answer. Whether or not is IP good, and so that they could check some box. And it's often a lot more subtle than that. That's not a problem. I don't mind, trying to boil something down to a check or not a check. But I found it much more interesting to work on the side of the client or the side of the startup, being able to create that strategy instead of evaluating it. A lot of patent attorneys don't necessarily get paid by investors to do that work, but the back scratching that's happening there is I'll do this work more or less for free, and then when you invest and take a seat on that board, you force them to work with me moving forward. And that, to me, wasn't the best way to grow a business. That was just a decision I made at some point. All right. That's the end of this lecture. What I'm going to do for about 10 minutes, if you are interested in this as a career, I'm intrigued by patent law, I want to learn a little bit more, I'll reserve about 5-10 minutes to answering questions about that concept. We'll probably do this again after lecture 8, but I'll answer a couple questions now. Thanks, guys.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.